You know, it's occurred to me that I haven't really commented on the terrible acting from English-speaking actors in my previous reviews, probably because I knew that this was going to be a recurring element to the Heisei series. However, this movie...
Kiss you guys.
An indestructible super plant will be complete.
But I want you make sure that the Japan does not produce any more of that. Is that clear?
Oh boy, this movie. Hello people of the internet, this is Kaiju Noir with another review in my retrospective of Toho's Heisei films. Today we'll be taking a look at the second installment of the rebooted Godzilla series, Godzilla vs. Biollante. The plot begins immediately right after the climax to the return of Godzilla, where the king of the monsters seemingly met his end as he fell into Mount Mahara. In the aftermath of the devastation, we see several political factions already fighting to reap the benefits of war, which in this case are Godzilla's skin samples left all over the city. We then cut to the fictional Middle Eastern country of Saradia, where the director of the country's Botanical Research Division makes a deal with Dr. Shiragami to use the Godzilla cells they've acquired to develop genetically modified plants to improve their country's agricultural economy. But before he can start working, a competing American company called Biollante attacked their lab in an attempt to destroy the G-cells, resulting in the death of Shiragami's daughter, Erika. Cut to 5 years later, and the Japanese government, now recovered from Godzilla's attack, attempts to use the G-cells they've collected to create anti-nuclear energy bacteria, or ANEB, to kill Godzilla should he ever break free of his volcanic prison. The government dispatches scientist Kirishima and Lieutenant Gondo to recruit Shiragami, now a social recluse. He agrees on the basis that they give him the G-cells for research. He then uses said G-cells' regenerative properties to create a new form of life through a rose that was previously merged with his daughter's cells in a desperate move to keep his daughter alive in some form. Eventually, Biollante and the same Saradian agent from 5 years prior attempts to steal the cells for themselves once again, only to find that the rose had mutated into a nightmarish horror beyond anyone's imagination. As a last resort, the lone Biollante agent threatens to reawaken Godzilla unless the G-cells are surrendered to him. Things do not go as planned, and now Japan must face threats both new and old. In my opinion, the best aspect of this film is how its plot directly ties into the previous film, which was actually pretty rare in previous entries of the franchise. We've seen the world's reaction to Godzilla in the last film, and now we get to witness the aftermath and the resulting impact left by the beast's actions. The Cold War element is still there, with numerous countries still vying at the chance to obtain the superior weapon, this time in the field of biological warfare. In a rather bold move, the film is willing to once again name-drop America as they put Japan in further danger, but in a more direct way. Then again, it's never explicitly stated that the Biollante agents actually work for their government, so perhaps it was through this ambiguity that allowed Toho to get away with this without causing a controversy. Instead of Russia, we now have a fictional country filling in for the role of the third political party. The use of a fictional country is very reminiscent of the Showa series, as it too used fictional locations such as Rolisica from 1961's Mothra in order to leave an allegory-driven political message about international relations between countries. Now, the thing that really puts a spin on this film is that, like Gunhead, Godzilla vs. Biollante is very much so influenced by 80s culture. The soundtrack is rocking out a crazy score that mixes traditional high-octane orchestral tracks along with full-on rock pieces such as BioWars. Many human action sequences feel right at home in a typical 80s action flick, with cheesy one-liners, guns a-blazing, and the over-the-top performances. At one point, one of the characters even name-drops an actual film, claiming that both he and his partner were, quote-unquote, the real lethal weapon. Even the Saradian agent is always seen in shades, which seems to be a visual callback to the Terminator. As hilariously entertaining as these scenes are, they do clash with the more serious aspects of the film, both in tone and pacing. That and the English-speaking actors, both the Caucasian and Japanese, don't exactly give the best performances we've seen in this franchise, especially when some of their dialogue can be hard to understand at certain points. In fact, of all the terrible English acting we'll be seeing in the Heisei series, this film features the absolute worst, with Shiragami constantly pausing after each syllable, the Saradian agent slurring through all of his lines, the Saradian director horrifically butchering basic English grammar, and of course the Biomajor agent's hilarious deliveries. As for the Japanese characters, they fit into roles that allow them to directly influence the events of the film, whereas the previous film's cast were merely bystanders reacting to the events surrounding them. Shiragami is a modern-day mad scientist, as he's someone who crosses that thin moral line with good intentions, believing that science can help benefit the world. He's also sympathetic as a single parent who lost his only child. In order to keep some part of her alive, he goes so far as to refer to her roses collectively as Erica, after genetically splicing them, and even obtains a psychic's help to see if Erica's presence is still around. Yeah, don't worry, we'll get back to that. Seeing the creature he himself unleashed upon the world, and its painful and lonely existence, he realizes the consequences of his selfish actions, and how science can be misused if placed in the wrong hands, especially in the case of the ANEB project. The film carries the theme of arrogance and punishment that the Godzilla series has always excelled at, by portraying humans as heavily flawed beings, and eventually having to pay for their actions in the end. The theme is also heavily enforced by the aforementioned struggle over the G-cells and ANEB Shiragami creates for Japan. In a way, Shiragami can be likened to Dr. Serizawa from the first Godzilla film, in that both men are scientists who create and are responsible for horrific weapons that can potentially lead to major shifts in political power and even greater devastation upon the world. Godzilla vs. Biollante has the distinction of introducing the character of Miki Sagusa, who would later appear in every installment of the Heisei series from here on out. Here, she's a young girl gifted with psychic abilities that allow her to sense the presence of living souls. She's also shown to even manipulate Godzilla's actions to a limited degree, at the cost of her own health. It's explained in the film that she's the best student from a facility that monitors, studies, and educates psychic children. However, the fact that psychics suddenly exist in this universe is never explained, as the audience is expected to simply accept that this is now a part of this continuity. While at the end of the day, this is a series where giant monsters and robots are common despite breaking all forms of logic and science, it still feels pretty jarring to me to suddenly introduce this sort of element without a proper explanation. It is possible that the reason for a character such as Miki to exist in the film was to have her act as a medium between the kaijus and humans, since she was able to deduce the spiritual nature of Biollante and the upcoming arrival of Godzilla. As for the most entertaining of the main cast, I've gotta give it to Gondo. This thrill-seeker is someone who just smiles in the face of death, and always remains calm and collective even in certain peril. His dialogue is incredibly amusing as he's just been itching for a fight with Godzilla after feeling so irrelevant for the last 5 years. After all, wouldn't you feel a little antsy if you were recruited specifically to lead a team of kaiju busters with the most up-to-date weaponry at your disposal, only to be pushed to the sidelines when the giant monster is no longer a threat? He's also very critical of scientists in general, believing that they can only make situations worse through their irresponsibility. It also has to be mentioned that his one-on-one confrontation with the Big G himself is among the most memorable interactions between Godzilla and a single human being. That is until we get to our next film. Finally, we have both Kirishima and his girlfriend Asuka, whose main purpose in the film, plot-wise, is to bring the other three players together, with Asuka being Gondo's sister and Miki's supervisor, while Kirishima is both Shiragami's assistant in creating the ANEB, and Gondo's friend and collaborator. They're also the most relatable to the audience, especially with Kirishima, who acts as the conservative scientist who, like Gondo, has a cynical view of the government's use of science as a means of pushing moral boundaries to obtain superiority. This, of course, leads to him despising Shiragami for the creation of Biollante. While both he and Asuka are in a relationship, they are unable to further pursue it due to both of them being uncertain about the future of their professional careers, thanks to Godzilla's presence. This subplot helps bring the audience up to speed as to what has transpired between films, and serves as a nice bookend to wrap up the story. Overall, the cast is distinguishable enough from the last film to give this sequel a different vibe, while also being able to be just as compelling. With Koichi Kawakita taking over as the special effects director for the series, the film improves in every way from its predecessor. One especially creative scene that's worth noting involves forced perspective, where Godzilla is shot walking through a city at a low angle with buildings in the foreground. In actuality, these models are only about knee-high and were physically scrolled backwards as the suit actor was moving forwards. Starting with the newcomer Biollante, she's an incredibly complex creation both in terms of her character and the practical effects used to portray her. Given that she was created from both Erica and Godzilla's DNA, she's an accidental creation of mankind, much like Godzilla, and like him, seems to live in pain and suffering due to her unnatural existence. She's also aggressively defensive like an animal, as she attacks both the terrorists during their raid on Shirogami's lab, and when confronted by Godzilla himself. The most confusing aspect of Biollante is the fact that she actually houses the spirit of Erica. I know it was established earlier that her rose contained her spirit in some form, but it's a plot point I always had an issue with. My question is, how do random human cells placed on a plant equal the preservation of a soul? The concept of human spirit inhabiting and being corrupted by a freak of science admittedly is very interesting and certainly hasn't been done before in a Godzilla film. But I think the whole spiritual angle should have been left vague, which would have allowed for a more surprising twist at the end, similar to how Kiryu was developed in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 13 years later. Moving past the technicalities of spiritual possessions, the effects that bring her to life are beyond amazing. Her rose form is very eerie given the humanoid shape it takes and its cries of agony. The monstrous final form is an achievement of practical effects given just how many puppeteers were used to operate her. Despite her small amount of screen time, the filmmakers do their absolute best with that time frame and have her leave a very large impression on the viewer. As for Godzilla, the filmmakers decided on giving his appearance a complete overhaul, giving us the now iconic design that would later be used for the rest of the Heisei series, with minor modifications made between films. I don't think I can fully state just how much I love this new, powerful and mammalian-esque design, and how it improves over the 84 suit. Plot-wise, his character is kept intact and doesn't lose that threatening edge that he held in the previous film. Being that he had thrown a wrench in the Cold War, everyone is in a race to defend themselves not only from each other, but now Godzilla. Much like the last film, Godzilla's reappearance is once again built up as a great deal. Once he marches out of Mount Mahara, he immediately lets humanity know that he runs the show, and that his reign of destruction was simply inevitable. While the bird call tactic is no longer used, for whatever reason, it sort of carries over into Biollante. As soon as she awakens, she cries out for help, to which Godzilla responds. If my theory is correct in that Godzilla followed the bird calls originally in search of someone like him, perhaps he responded to the call in that same fashion, given how similar these creatures are. Unfortunately for him, Biollante lashes out at him in fear, and thus his chance at companionship is rejected, causing the lone beast to stop at nothing to destroy the creature that wishes to destroy him. The last thing to note in terms of special effects is the Super X2, which doesn't have the same impact as its predecessor both on me nor the plot. It felt more like a continuity nod, and is overall not as effective as the Super X1, since that machine was actually close to killing Godzilla. It's mainly here to hold off Godzilla with its new reflective mirror system before the eventual showdown between the much more technically impressive kaijus. The score for Godzilla vs. Biollante was composed this time around by Koichi Sugiyama, and it feels a lot more dated than the last film. Not that that's a bad thing in my opinion. The theme for the Super X2 is just as heroic as the Super X1's theme, but is a bit more on the campy side, and feels the most 80s outside of Bio Wars, which is just crazy hair metal intertwined with Akira Ifukube's original Godzilla theme. Speaking of which, Ifukube's scores from the previous films were reused here to great effect. Not only do his compositions help improve the Mount Mahara scene, but also in one of my favorite scenes ever in the franchise. The setup involved young psychic children at the Institute drawing a similar vision that they all shared the night before. When Mickey asked them to show Asuka what they all drew, they all cheerfully showed their depictions of Godzilla's reign of death and destruction. What followed was Godzilla's classic theme to let us know that the king was returning. The stark contrast between the look of shock and terror on Asuka's face and the joyful children is so incredibly amusing that it has always stuck with me ever since I first saw this film as a child. Despite having an uneven tone and terrible English performances, Godzilla vs. Biollante's positive qualities are able to overcome everything else, allowing the sum of its parts to give audiences a unique entry in the franchise that provides tension, action, commentary, and even bits of unintentional comedy. Along with that, you get a Godzilla design that will go on to become the official look of Godzilla in future films, comics, action figures, video games, and even public appearances. I will state that from my own subjective point of view, The previously mentioned comedy actually benefited my viewing of the film, but it may not work with you, in which case I do recommend listening to the English dub of the film. I'm giving Godzilla vs. Biollante a 4 out of 5. Unfortunately for Toho, Godzilla vs. Biollante wasn't exactly the box office hit they were hoping for, which caused them to shift gears and cancel a Mothra reboot that would have featured Bagan, a fan-favorite kaiju that has only existed on the cutting room floor in terms of film appearances. Instead, Toho planned on reintroducing classic kaijus into the mix in the hopes that their recognizability would be enough for audiences to regain interest. Join me next time when I take a look at the resurrection of Godzilla's most fearsome foe, as I review Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. Until next time everybody, take care.